the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis. The story of the faith in this region boasts some of the richest Catholic history in the United States of America, including the first basilica in the country and one of the nation's greatest bishops. It carries on today under the leadership of its current apostle, Archbishop Bernard Hebda.
It's beautiful to be able to have that kind of succession that's there, and knowing that you're sent like the apostles. You have the same mission that the Lord gave to the apostles on the day of the Ascension.
This is the story of the bishops of America, the shepherds of the past and the shepherds of today, who through their callings and ministry carry the church into the future. It's also the story of their parish, their church, the cathedral. This is The Chair, an exploration of what it means to be an apostle in America. Sitting on either side of the mighty Mississippi River, the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis, Minnesota are two of the most scenic in the United States. They are also home to the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis.
This area is steeped in history. Indian Mounds Park resides within the city limits of St. Paul, and this park really attests to the presence of native peoples in these lands. They lived in this area for millennia, and the first mounds were built by the ancient peoples of the Hopewell tradition. Later tribes, such as the Dakota, continued burying their honored dead in these mounds for centuries.
Catholic missionary activity dates back to the mid-1600s. In the decades leading up to the establishment of the Diocese of St. Paul, Minnesota was a hive of missionary activity focused on evangelization efforts among the native peoples. But the rapid growth of American settlement and European immigration would shift the church's attention from missionary outreach to native peoples to ministry to those new settlers.
There was a settlement known as Pig's Eye. There were 16 families, 13 of whom were Catholic, and a wonderful missionary priest by the name of Father Lucien Gaultier. He got them to change the name of the settlement from Pig's Eye to St. Paul. Father Gaultier, the first priest, didn't last very long. He eventually went back to Europe. He had a change of heart and came back and continued his ministry later in what is Wisconsin. But these were very harsh climates. And so we start with this log chapel.
He builds a very small wooden chapel, basically a log cabin with the help of 13 families, each of them in many ways pitching in the supplies that they had. These settlers really come together as a community to build this physical structure, to build the structure of their faith. So really, the city of St. Paul has its foundations in the Catholic faith.
And then in 1851, when we become a diocese, it took almost 11 months for the first bishop to arrive. So he was named bishop in 1850, and it wasn't until July of 1851 that Bishop Joseph Cretin arrived. And it was total wilderness. And there wasn't much here, and they built from nothing. Well, obviously, the first thing they did was to begin the construction of a more proper church building. The log chapel had been expanded a few years after it was built, but it was still tiny. And then for a couple of years, that multi-purpose building existed. That was both a residence, it was also offices, there was even a little school there, and the second floor of the three-story building had a church.
As the community begins to grow and outgrow the log cabin church of St. Paul's, there is a need and an understanding that we need a larger structure. Many of the people are immigrants. Most of them do not have the money to contribute to a building fund. However, they would show up and offer their time and offer building supplies. So the church was literally built by the Catholic immigrant community of St. Paul.
To help in the work of building up the diocese, Bishop Crétin invited the Benedictines from St. Vincent's Abbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, to establish St. John's Abbey in what is now Collegeville, Minnesota. He also invited the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, Missouri, into the diocese. Among their accomplishments was the establishment of the College of St. Catherine's.
The first Archbishop of St. Paul was the great John Ireland. Now, he's born in Ireland, he grew up in St. Paul, and he's very committed to the local church. Now, Ireland believed that the life on the prairies could provide the social and economic opportunity that the Catholic immigrants who were literally coming into the country wave after wave, that life on the prairies could provide them with an opportunity to be fully American and fully Catholic. He believed that these efforts could help fight nativist concerns that often resulted in the great anti-Catholic bigotry of the 19th century. In short, John Ireland wanted to show that Catholics could prosper in the United States.
Bishop Ireland worked to cultivate relationships with members of the civic and political elite. Perhaps none was more important to Bishop Ireland in his plans than the friendship he developed with James J. Hill. He also helped to endow St. Paul's Seminary, established in 1895, which was one of Bishop Ireland's signature projects in the diocese.
He very much disapproved of national parishes. He felt that Catholics and immigrants especially should assimilate into the United States as rapidly as possible.
He believed in being a solid American and a solid Catholic. He once went to one of our parishes out in a suburb now, and he gave them a very strong tongue lashing about how they were insular and how they were limiting their children's chances for success by becoming an ethnic ghetto. And he said, now of course he spoke native English, obviously this was a German community, but he was very clear, you need to learn English and you need to become Americans. Now that all led to the whole issue of Americanism, which is a whole separate issue. I think he was very wrongly accused of that. He was also a teetotaler, so temperance movement was very important to him. Settlement was very important to him. He helped, along with James J. Hill, the railroad magnate, to be able to begin to build communities west of the Twin Cities at that time, to populate people, land issues. So he was definitely way ahead of his time in so many areas.
St. Paul was elevated to an archdiocese in 1888, 4 years into John Ireland's tenure as bishop. Ireland began construction of both the Cathedral of St. Paul and the co-cathedral, later Basilica of St. Mary in Minneapolis in 1907.
Two prominent laymen approached then Archbishop Ireland and said, we'd like to purchase a mansion for you as your episcopal residence. Thankfully, he said, no, it's too grandiose. But he came back to them a year later and said, but it would be a splendid place for a cathedral. And so they purchased it. He selected an architect by the name of Emmanuel Masqueret, and they broke ground, the preparations, and then the cornerstone was laid on June 2nd, 1907.
His vision of this cathedral was one that it would reflect the American church as the body of Christ. It should be strong, it should be unified, and encompass the many different immigrant groups and cultures and languages that made up the Catholic Church in the United States.
It was very hard to fill his shoes, that's for sure. I don't really even think to do that. I try to set my sights a little bit lower. But certainly just the massiveness of the cathedral and the prominence of where it sits in the city gives a pretty strong indicator that the church is here to stay and that the church wants to be involved.
The Cathedral of St. Paul and the Cathedral Basilica of St. Mary are two of the most extraordinary cathedrals in America. So from the exterior, you know that this is just the most important building in the city. It is a palace to God. The architecture is Beaux-Arts. It's heavily French-influenced Renaissance revival. And so it's really incredible that these churches were built in the United States in the 20th century. They truly could be in Paris or in Rome. The cathedrals are unique in their form, but very similar in their incredible power of invitation and peace. St. Paul's is monumental in scale, and yet it's very inviting. There is a great sense of mystery, and the spaces invite you in. The ornament, which is quite grand and very beautiful, has the function of formalistically supporting the architecture. Heavily ornamented plaster, mosaic, gold leaf, murals. In the crossing are representations of the evangelists on the pillars of the church.
The baldacchino is amazing because it is constructed on 6 huge marble columns, each of which is a single piece. And imagine trying to get those over on a ship. That top of the baldacchino is brass and bronze, and so it's very, very sturdy. There's even a tiny statue of St. Paul that you can barely see on the very front of the dome cover.
The organ is not only an auditory splendor, but also a visual splendor. The stained glass is impressive, and the way that the light floods this really massive and very stately cathedral is impressive. Light becomes one of the materials in the church construction. When you enter, you'll see that there are always visitors, and this is another way in which it's sort of like a European cathedral, that it draws people in, some of whom are religious and who are there to pray, and others who are just invited in by the beauty. And it has always used beauty the way that it does in nature to attract, to draw us in, and to bring us to truth, and the source of all beauty, which is God himself.
When you're in a church like this, you really want to be able to lead too, and you know that the Lord has a plan for us all. I have that sense that the Lord wants to do something really important here.
For the people of St. Paul and Minneapolis, their living connection to the ministry of Peter is the bishop. And in each cathedral, the chair or cathedra represents his authority as a successor of the apostles. The current apostle of St. Paul, Minneapolis is Archbishop Bernard Hebda.
When I was a real little boy, we lived on the south side of Pittsburgh, which was an old immigrant community where the steel mills were found along the banks of the Monongahela. So my father was one of 8, and my mother was one of 3. My grandparents on my dad's side had immigrated from Poland. My grandfather worked in a mill, as was most often the case. And then on my mother's family, they had been here from the time of the potato famine. I always thought in the back of my mind maybe about going to the Capuchin Franciscans after high school. And I went and I spoke with them in my senior year. And they talked to me about what were the options that I had for university. And when I kind of laid them out to them, they said, oh, you're much better off to go to a regular college. Same thing, if the Lord's asking you to be a priest, he's going to be asking you when you finish with college as well. I ended up at Harvard, which ended up being a beautiful choice for me. And I have to tell you, I didn't think about being a priest when I was at Harvard. And I was still involved in campus ministry there. And I had graduated early from Harvard, and that I would use that 4th year kind of as a time to figure out, do I want to be a lawyer or not? What had happened when I was in law school, I really became much more involved with the church at that point than I had. I found that I could go to daily mass at the university chapel. It was a place where I came to appreciate the importance of the Eucharist. As I was discerning what the Lord wanted me to do, it was that encounter with Jesus in the Eucharist when I was at Columbia that really was most instrumental. That I came to recognize that Being a priest was something where you could really have an impact. I'm trying to get to Mass every day. I find that the Lord is blessing me in prayer. And so I was beginning to think maybe the Lord really did want me to be a priest. So it was a little bit of a difficult decision. And I thought if I didn't give seminary a try, I probably never would. I went to St. Paul's in Pittsburgh, and we did philosophy at Duquesne.
Bernard Anthony Hebda was ordained to the priesthood on July 1st, 1989.
Morning of the ordination was very powerful. It was in another cathedral of St. Paul, the Cathedral of St. Paul in Pittsburgh. But my first real parish assignment was at this Prince of Peace parish on Southside, and that was bringing together 7 communities. I was asked to do campus ministry, but there was an opening at Slippery Rock University at the Newman Center there. And so I did that for a year. That was heavenly. And it was great to be able to work with young people. I would have stayed there for the rest of my priesthood if I could. And the bishop calls me up and he says, I had a phone call from Rome. They would like you to work at the Pontifical Council for Legislative Texts. So I went kind of kicking and screaming. And the bishop said, well, try it for a year, and if you don't like it, I'll bring you home. I ended up staying there for 13 years, and I formed some great friendships there that I continue to value today.
In 2003, Father Hebda was named the Undersecretary of the Pontifical Council. While in Rome, he was also an adjunct spiritual director at the Pontifical North American College and confessor to the Missionaries of Charity.
So there was one day, and I got called down to the Congregation for Bishops. And so I go with my yellow legal pad, thinking it's work-related. And then the Cardinal comes in, Cardinal Ray, and I didn't know him well, but I knew him from the elevator. And he said, oh, I'm very happy to tell you that the Holy Father has named you Bishop of Gaylord in Michigan. And I said, well, can I have a little bit of time? He said, yeah, take the weekend. I said, yeah, I want a letter, but when you come back in, bring in the letter telling the Holy Father how happy you are to be the next Bishop of Gaylord. It was a shock. I obviously, I had prayed about it and was somewhat resistant even when I went in on Monday, but I left the letter for the Holy Father saying, yes, I'd be happy to do that. It was announced on the 7th of October, Our Lady of the Rosary, the smallest sea city in the United States. Now, it feels much bigger than 3,600, but the only day you have traffic is Christmas Eve coming out of Walmart. That's it.
After 4 years as the Bishop of Gaylord, Michigan, and nearly 2 years as the Coadjutor Bishop of Newark, New Jersey, on June 15, 2015, Pope Francis appointed Archbishop Hebda as the Apostolic Administrator of St. Paul, Minnesota. On March 24, 2016, he was named the new Archbishop.
I was asked to be the administrator, so I was going back and forth. He said, well, I'd like you to spend 2/3 of your time in the Twin Cities and 1/3 in Newark, doing the administrative stuff here, and then doing the fun pastoral things there. And I realized these are people that really love the church, that really want to see the church get out of this morass. I've never worked with people who have been more talented, lay people and priests. And so certainly this year, as we've been dealing with COVID, but then in the midst of all of that, then to get the civil unrest and really the punch to the gut that was the killing of George Floyd. What struck me this year, and we were in the midst of the turbulence in the community. So as I'm ordaining, I can hear the military helicopters that are circling in this area because it was still in the days of the huge demonstrations. As the men are going forward to give communion to their families, they're putting on the hospital masks. I really had that deep sense that the Lord had ordained these men for just a time like this, with, Pope Francis has talked about the church being the field hospital. These are the front line in that field hospital, and they're going to be able to navigate the challenges in a new way. You recognize that you're not doing it alone. This is not one apostle, there's a whole college of apostles. And so we're working together, certainly with brother bishops, not just those present, but those who have gone before us as well. Just that opportunity, when we look at the apostles and we see that they all have human flaws, that certainly gives me encouragement, and knowing that the Lord uses those of us who are weak nonetheless. You know that the Lord has a plan for us all. Archbishop Ireland was certain of that. The bishops who have followed him have been certain of that. And this church has a wonderful history. That connection between faith and service is something that's always been important here that we have to continue to develop. So they're all things that were important for Archbishop Ireland, and they're still important today.